Now, Libya, what's the latest in Libya? Those of you who have been following my podcast would know that last month I mentioned Libya as the top story. The civil conflict between the internationally recognized and UN-backed government in Tripoli, known as the GNA, versus the rival government in the east, which is propped up by renegade commander Khalifa Hafter. This civil conflict brought in many actors, many players, many mercenaries from different parts of the world. It almost split up allies in Europe, such as Italy and France, and could have triggered World War III. Now, since last month, things have calmed down slightly. There are still hostilities, there are still tensions. Fighting is still going on between Khalifa Haftar's forces and the forces of the Tripoli government. But this time last month, Haftar, going into the ceasefire talks in Berlin, he actually seemed on the verge of taking Tripoli and establishing himself as the sole authority in the country. But since then, he has been stalled just outside of Tripoli at the Mitiga airport. A lot of clashes are happening there. In fact, a few times flights to and from Mitiga airport have been cancelled because of attacks in and around the airport by Khalifa Haftar's forces. And that is still ongoing. But in fact, now not only has Haftar been stalled at the airport, he's not being able to make any progress beyond that airport. The airport is very heavily saturated by Turkish troops who have come to the aid of the Tripoli government. But now actually the Tripoli government themselves say that they are not just defending the airport, but they are preparing a counterattack against Haftar's forces. So I doubt that Haftar will be able to get any further west of that airport. What is the most likely scenario, in my opinion, is that this is how it's going to stay. Neither the Eastern government is going to oust the Western government, nor is the Western government going to oust the East. There's going to be some kind of ceasefire. Eventually, they're going to have to come to terms in terms of how to resume the export of Libyan oil to the outside world in order to rejuvenate Libya's economy, because under the current situation there is a blockade. No oil is being exported, and the Libyan economy as a whole is suffering. Libyan people as a whole are suffering, both east and west. So eventually they're going to have to overcome this dispute and start looking out for the interest of the Libyan people. Now, probably Turkey is going to consolidate its foothold in Tripoli. And that's all it really needs. Turkey does not need the government in Tripoli to take control of the whole country. What Turkey really needs in Libya is an ally, and they have that ally in the UN-backed government. And so long as that ally is there, then Turkey, the deal between the maritime deal that was struck in December between Turkey and the UN-backed government in Tripoli will remain, and Turkey will be able to assert itself as a maritime power even more than it already is in the Eastern Mediterranean, and that's all Turkey wants. What happens east of Tripoli, I don't really think Turkey is too concerned. Haftar, meanwhile, acknowledging that he probably cannot advance further west, he probably cannot take the city of Tripoli, he will probably do his best to consolidate whatever he can in the east of the country. He has not received the support to the level that he was looking for. Yes, the United Arab Emirates are continuing to send him weapons and funds. Yes, he does have mercenaries, Russian mercenaries particularly, fighting on his side. But it's not enough for him to fight against Turkey and to oust Turkey and the UN-backed government from Tripoli. France is giving its spiritual support. Egypt is giving its spiritual support. But Egypt is not going to give, neither of them rather, are going to give any military support to Haftar. France has got other interests in working together with Turkey, which it doesn't want to jeopardize. And at the same time, Egypt sees a military intervention in Libya as being too costly and has very little return on investment. Now, Egypt is actually already on the edge economically. In February last month rather, Egypt saw the birth of its 100 millionth citizen, and it's suffering from overpopulation as it is. It's suffering from disputes over its water resources and water management. Now, Egypt is still very heavily dependent on the River Nile. Upwards of 90% of its population still live along the River Nile. There's very little opportunity outside of that. The entire agricultural sector is based on the Nile, and there is currently a dispute with Ethiopia over a dam that's being built at the source of the Nile in Ethiopia, which could actually lower the amount of water, reduce the amount of water that is being pumped into Egypt, and severely affect Egypt's economy, and particularly the agricultural sector. The agricultural sector of Egypt already is actually consuming more water than the River Nile can supply. So Egypt has a lot of questions that it needs to answer about its future, its economic future, and being able to look after a population of 100 million people, a huge proportion of which are actually under the age of 25. It needs to consider how it's going to create jobs and opportunities for these people in order to avoid some kind of rebellion. Now, one thing that Egypt was looking forward to was the export of gas. Egypt has been working in the Eastern Mediterranean to identify sources of hydrocarbons that it could perhaps begin to export to the European market in order to rejuvenate its economy. But many experts are saying that there is a gas glut being predicted. The Zohr gas field in Egypt's waters, is not going to deliver as much as it promises, and Egypt will not be able to enter that market. So Egypt really needs to start looking for other ways. In terms of military expansion, that's always an option. Whenever a country is in a situation like Egypt is today, it needs new pastures for its people in order to keep them happy, in order to keep them in employment, and in order to keep things going. But with Egypt just locked along the River Nile, east and west of that is just full of desert. There's not really much livable space that Egypt can move into geographically. So actually it's probably better for Libya, for Haftar, to not allow Egypt to get involved militarily, because if Egypt is going to send its army into Libya to do all of the fighting, they're going to be shedding their blood on Libyan soil. Then after the war's done, even if Haftar was to win that war with Egyptian support, Egypt will want something back, and they would be in their right to request priority in terms of job opportunities and business and influence in the region. So there is that element that Haftar in Libya needs to consider as well. But what Haftar is doing to counter the Western government and to counter Turkey's influence in the region is it's actually his Eastern Libyan government is actually working to create an aura of legitimacy around itself by establishing diplomatic relations with other countries. Now, one thing that happened this week particularly was that a delegation from the Eastern Libyan government went to meet with the Syrian regime leader Bashar al-Assad in Damascus, and they agreed to establish diplomatic missions in both countries, and they signed a memorandum of understanding to counter what they call Turkish aggression in both countries. Now, this agreement was probably on the whole no more than a symbolic gesture, but it is creating the illusion that the Haftar regime in Libya has more legitimacy. It has the backing of Arab countries such as Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and now Syria. And they are, in a way, the Haftar regime and the Assad regime in Syria are helping each other regain some kind of legitimacy as Arab governments.